For decades, Pastor Joyce Meyer has been one of the most recognizable voices in modern Christianity, filling arenas, dominating Christian television, and building a ministry worth millions. To her followers, she was a symbol of strength, redemption, and unshakable faith. But now, troubling signs are stacking up. And for the first time in a long while, things aren't looking good. Behind the polished sermons and confident smile, a quiet storm has been brewing. A sudden decision to walk away from a major Christian network has raised eyebrows across the faith world. Longtime supporters are asking why. Critics are asking what took so long. And insiders are whispering that this isn't just a simple business move, it's damage control. As allegations rock the very platforms that helped elevate her voice, Joyce Meyer finds herself caught in a moment she can't preach her way out of. Her name isn't on the accusations, but her association is impossible to ignore. And in today's climate, association alone can be devastating, even more unsettling. This crisis reopens old wounds, past questions about money, influence, and the true cost of televangelism that many assumed were buried long ago. Suddenly, stories people forgot are being remembered. Statements once ignored are being re-examined. Is this just another test of faith, or the beginning of the most challenging chapter of Joyce Meyer's public life? Because this time, silence may speak louder than any sermon. For years, Pastor Joyce Meyer appeared untouchable. Her sermons aired across the globe, her books filled shelves in Christian homes, and her voice carried authority that few in televangelism could match. To millions, she wasn't just a pastor. She was proof that faith could overcome trauma, poverty, and even a painful past. That image was carefully built over decades, brick by brick, sermon by sermon. But now the foundation beneath it is starting to shake. The first cracks didn't come from the pulpit. They came quietly, almost politely, wrapped in the language of pausing and discernment. When Joyce Meyer Ministries announced it would step away from Daystar Television Network, the wording felt calm, measured, even righteous. But to those who understand the evangelical media world, this was no small adjustment. It was a loud move disguised as a soft one. Daystar wasn't just another channel. It was one of the most powerful platforms in Christian broadcasting, responsible for carrying Joyce Meyer's messages into millions of homes worldwide. Walking away from that kind of reach isn't done lightly, especially not by a ministry that understands how influence translates into impact, donations, and loyalty. The decision instantly raised a question no one could ignore. What happened behind the scenes that made staying more dangerous than leaving? As allegations of misconduct and cover-ups at Daystar began circulating, the uncomfortable reality set in. Joyce Meyer's name was not directly tied to the accusations, but her ministry had benefited from the same platform now under fire. In the court of public perception, that distinction often doesn't matter. Silence, timing, and proximity all become evidence in the minds of critics. Supporters rush to defend her, pointing out that she chose to step away rather than protect a lucrative relationship. And that's true to a point. But critics push back just as fast, asking why it took controversy this severe for such a powerful voice to act. Was this a moral stand? Or a strategic retreat? What makes this moment especially dangerous isn't just the Daystar scandal itself, it's what it awakens. Joyce Meyer's ministry has faced scrutiny before. Years ago, investigations and media reports questioned her lifestyle, the use of donations, and the growing wealth tied to her brand. Though reforms were made and the storms passed, those stories never fully disappeared. They simply faded, waiting. Now they're back. In today's digital age, memory is ruthless. Old articles are reposted. Archived interviews resurface. Criticism once brushed aside suddenly feels relevant again. And for pastors built on trust, perception can be more damaging than proof. Joyce Meyer's message has always centered on personal victory, obedience, and accountability, values that invite higher expectations from followers. Another complication is generational change. The audience that once embraced televangelism without question is shrinking. Younger Christians are far more skeptical of mega ministries, especially those tied to wealth, celebrity, and media empires. For them, walking away from a scandal isn't heroism, it's the bare minimum. The standards have changed, and Joyce Meyer now faces a generation less willing to separate the message from the machinery behind it. Internally, this kind of crisis forces hard decisions. Broadcast platforms shape donations. Donations shape outreach. Outreach defines relevance. Any disruption at the top echoes all the way down. Even if the ministry remains financially stable, confidence, once shaken, is difficult to fully restore. What's most striking is the tone shift. Joyce Meyer has always been outspoken, direct, even confrontational when needed. But now there's restraint. Few personal statements. No fiery sermons addressing the controversy head-on. Just careful distance. That restraint may be wisdom, or it may signal that the situation is far more delicate than it appears. This moment isn't about one network or one decision. It's about what happens when long-standing power structures are tested in public. Joyce Meyer spent a lifetime building influence in a system that is now under a microscope. And for the first time, the narrative isn't fully in her control. As the fallout from the Daystar controversy continued to spread. Something subtle but telling happened around Joyce Meyer's ministry. The tone of public conversation began to change. This wasn't outrage driven by headlines. It was quieter, more unsettled. The kind of doubt that doesn't explode, but slowly erodes confidence over time. For years, Joyce Meyer positioned herself not just as a pastor, but as a survivor who understood pain. Her story, abuse, hardship, redemption, made her relatable in a world where megachurch leaders often feel distant and polished. But relatability creates expectation. When followers feel connected, they also feel entitled to clarity when things go wrong. And clarity has been in short supply. While her ministry framed the departure from Daystar as a principled pause, critics noticed what wasn't said. There was no direct condemnation. No emotional address to viewers. No explanation in her own voice laying out the moral line being drawn. Instead, communication came through press-style statements, professional, careful, and safe. In an age where transparency is demanded, that choice felt calculated. That calculation fed a larger narrative that has trailed Joyce Meyer for decades. Control? Not just over her brand, but over how much access the public has to uncomfortable truths. Former supporters online began revisiting past sermons, interviews, and financial disclosures with fresh scrutiny. Questions once labeled anti-Christian attacks were now being asked by Christians themselves. One issue resurfaced repeatedly: money. Joyce Meyer Ministries has long insisted it operates with accountability and generosity. And to be fair, significant reforms were made after earlier public pressure. But perception is stubborn. Lavish conference stages, best-selling books, and the machinery of Christian media all blur the line between ministry and empire. In moments of stability, followers overlook that tension. In moments of scandal, it becomes unavoidable. More damaging than outside criticism has been the visible hesitation among fellow faith leaders. Some ministries quickly distanced themselves from the Daystar fallout. Others said nothing at all. Silence within influential religious circles is rarely neutral. It often signals behind-the-scenes uncertainty. Leaders weighing the cost of association before choosing sides. This is where Joyce Meyer's situation grows complicated. She isn't facing an accusation, she's facing an atmosphere. An environment where trust is fragile and reputations are no longer insulated by history or popularity. In today's landscape, legacy doesn't shield leaders the way it once did. If anything, it raises the stakes. Adding pressure is the shifting digital spotlight. Younger audiences are dissecting ministry culture through short clips, commentary channels, and reaction videos. Context disappears. Patterns remain. And Joyce Meyer, once celebrated as groundbreaking, now risks being grouped with a generation of televangelists many see as symbols of excess rather than faith. There's also the psychological toll of leadership during crisis. Ministries rarely acknowledge it, but prolonged controversy forces internal reckoning. Advisors push caution. Lawyers shape language. Public relations tighten messages. In that environment, spontaneity dies, and with it, warmth. What followers feel as distance is often bureaucracy, closing ranks. What's most unsettling for longtime fans is the absence of reassurance. Joyce Meyer built her voice on conviction, strong, unmistakable, often blunt. The softer, restrained posture feels unfamiliar. Not wrong, necessarily, but unfamiliar enough to make people wonder whether this moment has shaken her more deeply than she's willing to admit. Faith leaders often preach about storms revealing foundations. This storm isn't testing belief, it's testing credibility. And credibility doesn't collapse in a single moment. It fades when questions linger too long without answers. Right now, Joyce Meyer stands at a crossroads few public figures talk about openly, whether to protect the institution she built or risk destabilizing it by telling the full, uncomfortable truth. And the longer that decision takes, the louder the silence becomes as the controversy drags on. The most dangerous shift for Joyce Meyer isn't happening in headlines, it's happening in trust. Trust doesn't vanish overnight, it weakens in stages. First comes confusion, then disappointment, finally detachment. And for a ministry built on personal connection, detachment is the real threat. Donations don't stop because of one story. Attendance doesn't drop because of one pause in broadcast. What changes first is enthusiasm. People still listen, but they listen differently. Sermons that once felt empowering now feel cautious. Encouragement that once felt personal now feels scripted. Followers begin to wonder whether the confidence they admired was rooted in faith or in control. Insiders understand something most viewers don't. Ministries run on momentum. Conferences are booked months in advance. Media schedules are tightly managed. Partnerships depend on reputation. When uncertainty creeps in, sponsors quietly hesitate. Invitations grow selective. Questions get asked that never used to be asked before. None of this happens publicly, but leaders feel it immediately. Joyce Meyer's greatest strength has always been authority. Not loud authority, but certainty. She spoke as someone who knew exactly where she stood. Today, that certainty feels carefully rationed. Every word measured. Every appearance limited. Every response filtered. Alone tells observers this situation isn't minor. Another layer adding pressure is accountability or the demand for it. In modern faith culture, followers no longer want reassurance alone. They want process. They want to know who knew what and when. They want leaders to say not just, "We stepped away," but "Here's why. Here's what we learned, and here's how we'll prevent this again." Without that, even well-intentioned silence feels like avoidance. At the same time, Joyce Meyer is facing a no-win dilemma. If she speaks too openly, she risks legal and institutional fallout. If she stays reserved, she risks emotional disconnection from her base. This is the paradox of influence at her level. Transparency costs power, but withholding it costs trust. What's also resurfacing is the question of succession. Joyce Meyer is no longer building, she's preserving. Ministries at this stage must prove they can survive without their founder at the center. Scandals accelerate that question. Supporters begin to ask who will lead next, and whether the foundation is strong enough to outlive its creator. When uncertainty surrounds the present, the future becomes even more fragile. Critics argue that this moment exposes a larger issue within televangelism itself, a system where platforms matter more than accountability, and where separation from scandal happens only when exposure becomes unavoidable. Supporters argue she did the right thing by stepping away. Both can be true, and that's exactly why the situation is so uncomfortable. Moral clarity thrives on conviction, not nuance. And right now, everything feels nuanced. Perhaps most painful is the emotional disconnect for those who believed deeply in her message. For them, this isn't about networks or allegations. It's about disappointment, that someone who taught courage now appears cautious, that someone who preached truth now seems hesitant to address it directly. History shows that leaders rarely fall because of a single mistake. They falter when people stop believing they'll be honest in hard moments. Joyce Meyer still has influence, resources, and loyalty, but loyalty shifts when faith becomes conditional. This section of her story isn't being written by critics or defenders alone. It's being shaped by time. And time has a way of revealing whether silence is wisdom or fear. One thing is clear now. This crisis has moved beyond damage control. It's become a test of legacy. Now comes the part every long-standing ministry eventually faces, the reckoning with legacy. Joyce Meyer is no longer fighting for relevance. She's fighting for how her story will be remembered. And this moment, more than any sermon she's preached in recent years, may define the closing perception of her public life. For decades, she taught that obedience meant doing the hard thing even when it cost comfort. Critics are watching closely to see if that principle applies here. Because walking away from a platform is only the first step. What follows matters far more. Will there be transparency? Will there be ownership of association? Or will time be relied on to quietly smooth everything over? The modern audience isn't waiting patiently. They're watching patterns. If the pause from Daystar slowly turns into permanent silence on the issue, many will interpret that not as peace but as retreat. And retreat has consequences. It deepens skepticism. It confirms the fear that institutions protect themselves first, principles second. Yet, it would be a mistake to assume this is the end. Joyce Meyer has survived storms before. She's rebuilt narratives, adapted messaging, and restructured systems under intense pressure. Few leaders reach her level without resilience. The real question isn't whether she can continue, it's what continuing will look like. A full, personal address could reframe everything. Not one shaped by lawyers or press teams, but one rooted in moral clarity. That risk could restore trust. It could also fracture alliances. Most leaders at this stage avoid that gamble. Protecting the institution feels safer than confronting it. At the same time, silence has its own cost. Younger believers are forming their conclusions quickly, without emotional attachment to her legacy. For them, avoidance equals complicity. Their loyalty is conditional, earned daily, revoked quickly. And they are the future audience ministries either adapt to or lose entirely. Internally, decisions made now will echo long after headlines fade. Advisors will push caution. Donors will watch responses. Networks will assess risk. Every move signals whether the ministry values preservation over principle. In a media-saturated age, even inaction speaks. This moment could become a turning point, not because of scandal, but because of response. Joyce Meyer still has the opportunity to define the narrative before it defines her. Few leaders are granted that chance once trust begins to flicker. But the window narrows with each passing week. History rarely offers clean endings. Reputations erode gradually or they're renewed through truth. Right now, Joyce Meyer stands between those outcomes. Both require sacrifice. Only one requires courage. The storm didn't begin with her. But how it ends? Very well might, because in the end, faith leaders aren't remembered for the platforms they stood on. They're remembered for what they did when those platforms started to shake.